you are a person and you have these rights. And I really like that perspective of not thinking about it based on just what country you're in or what county you're in. It's you're a person, and inherently the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to you.
Connected Conversations with Lena Perova. Bridging worlds, one conversation at a time.
Right, and welcome back to Connected Conversations. And today we have Michael Mulé. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we are talking about promoting language access in the United States for equity and inclusion. So, Michael, this topic is very dear to me. I came to the US 25 years ago. The spring is going to be 25 years ago. To me, language, it's not just a tool for communication. I truly believe that language is information, and information is power. For any community to prosper, I believe there are two things that are very important. It's information and communication. I grew up in the country. It's former Soviet Union and then Russian Federation after 90s. So what I learned is that for my government, and then I've been traveling a lot, I've been to 95 countries. So what I see is any government, when they try to control or sort of take the rights from the community, what they do is they cut the information and they cut the means of communication. And that's when the community starts going down in their development. So what I really believe that for any community to prosper, it's equal access for information and free of communication. That's the reason why I'm here, and then the reason why I started this business that I've been running for 15 years now. And I know that's very dear to you too, and that's why you started your line of, that's why you're doing what you're doing, language access.
Yeah, I mean, my first experience, my first exposure to it was really during law school. I had in law school, you have a clinical program where you have supervision and you can work with clients. And one of my first clients was actually a woman who was from Central America, and she was living in the area where my law school was. And her first language was Spanish, and she spoke some English, but not enough. And so seeing her world and what she had to go through, she was very educated, but not so proficient in English. So all the things related to her son, right? The 504 plan, the IEP meetings, all of his medical stuff. Those were all points in her day where she couldn't get that information, where she couldn't understand what people were sharing with her or what they were asking from her. I only did a little part of the work, solving all the things, but the piece I got to work on, I really saw that, wow, this can't be the only person, right, who has this need. This can't be the only person who has a challenge communicating with the school district, who has questions when they get this bottle, right? And it has pills in it, but the label's not in any other language. They can't understand what it is. How many do I give? Like, what's the instructions? Or when you go to the hospital. So that was my first exposure point, was her as a client. And so I remember that. I mean, it really stuck with me. It made me realize, one, they don't cover this topic in law school. What are these rights? What are protections? But two, I think I want to do something in this. I just don't know what. And so I had a chance my third year of law school, because law school's 3 years in the States, for a fellowship. And they said, you can pitch what you want. What do you want the fellowship to be? And I proposed a Spanish language program to help Spanish, because I was thinking of that client, right? And it was, you just put in, you don't know you're going to get it. You put in the application, hopefully you get it. So I got it, which I was really glad, because I didn't have a job, honestly, after law school. And that was in Rochester, New York. And that's the start of my work. But if I had not had that exposure, if I had not had that moment of, wow, that must be really hard to understand what's going on with medications, the interactions, how does she do that? What should be there? It feels like there are things there. Why was this not happening the right way? And I didn't understand it that well in law school, but I soon realized, like, there are protections. There are things that need to be there, because we don't have an official language in this country, right? There's no federal English as the official language. There are protections for people's civil rights. But starting out, How do I figure out what those are? Because my work was one-on-one with individual clients. So you got to hear these stories of, I came from wherever, I'm having this experience here, here, and here. And I started seeing like the patterns. I'm like, this is just not in one place or one office. Like, this is their whole day, right? It happens at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Then they go to the health office. Then they go to the school. Then they go to this. Like, it's the same kind of barrier, and it's not because they don't want to do the right thing. It's because they can't get, to your point, the information they need at those points in their day. That's really what got me started on it. Just by chance that was one of my first clients.
And I heard that story because you were sharing that story on the Language Success podcast. And when you started assisting that woman and her son, I believe that she had a son, and then you just realized that you were following her from one agency to another and helping the son. And you realized that the son was not doing so well in school because they simply didn't have access to the information that they needed. I'm curious, did you have a chance to ever reconnect with that family?
I did not have a chance to reconnect with that family, but I will tell you that that experience, that clinic, was twofold. So not only did I get to work with her like as a family who has limited English proficiency, but that clinic, I also worked on disability rights issues. So I actually had a chance to work on some of the accessibility for people who are protected under the ADA or Section 504. And I did that work too in my first job. And I worked in Rochester, they have a very large deaf, hard of hearing community. So that clinic pretty much set me up for both working with persons who were LEP and then my deaf clients that I had. I have not had a chance to reconnect with her. I've definitely reconnected with that clinic. And I think those types of experiences are so helpful when you're going through learning. There's only so much you can do in a book. Like, you need to have the real experience, right? Like, no one learns how to be an interpreter from reading a book about how to be a good interpreter, right? You have to actually do the work and understand. And these were new topics to me. I mean, they weren't covered in my other classes in law school, right? Like, you might have a class on employment discrimination or like constitutional rights, but you didn't really have a class talking about those kinds of civil rights. And it was very hard at first because no one was really doing the work. And then I started finding the communities of people that were doing it, the attorneys, the community groups, the individual advocates that were all over the country we didn't really, some people might have called it language access, but it wasn't really called that yet, and they were doing this work in their little communities. It started from, a lot of times they had a client or they had someone in their community and they had this problem, and it shouldn't be like that. This should not be like that. This needs to be changed. And they worked hard and they pushed, and a lot of times without an attorney. Just that community, that language group, that was a barrier for them. It's a barrier for others in the community, pushing for a change in a local law, a change in an ordinance, a change in an office policy, but helps so many other people. Those are really the people that are doing a lot of the work. They come to the attorney, hopefully that knows what to do with it, and they say, this is going on. How can this get fixed? Sometimes the attorney doesn't know what to do. Sometimes that's something no one knows what to do with. They figure out a way. There's a lot of advocates in cities that you can probably guess, like in San Francisco and like in New York City, that have been doing this kind of work for decades and decades. But it is really back to, what are they not getting access to, right? Like, these critical systems, these critical pieces of information that everyone else can access.
So how did you start? Why did you choose your career in law in the first place?
Well, my interest in law actually started from when I was in college. I got very lucky in my junior year. I got to study abroad. I got to study a semester in Rome, which I'd never been outside the U.S. before that time. It was very scary. But when I was there, I really was exposed to a lot of things. First, there was a lot of different people in my college, right? They were students from what was formerly Yugoslavia. There were students from, what were part of what was then Russia. There were students from Western Europe. There were students from, Northern Africa. And there's all these incredible students, and they had all these different perspectives in our classes. And I was like, this is so interesting. And of course, linguistically, like, they had 3, 4, 5 languages, no problem, right? But what I really saw, what I really learned was, the European Union kind of approach, right? Probably about 27 countries right now. I don't know the exact total, but at that time, you had so many countries. How do they share their information linguistically? Like, they were developing systems there to make sure everyone was informed, make sure they had materials in local. And I saw that. I was like, this is so interesting that they're like doing this not just for general information, but, human rights, civil rights, well, they don't really call them civil rights there, but the human rights, European Union, like human rights charters and things like that, those are all available in multiple languages. And I was like, this human rights thing is a thing I'm kind of interested in. And so my third year of law school, luckily I had a professor from United Kingdom and then another professor from Australia. And they taught these international human rights seminars. And I got really interested in how do we understand these rights that are so basic, rights that are like in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, like founding documents of the UN, right? And one of them is actually language rights, like the right to communicate. I was like, this could be a thing I do where I work on international human rights. To work on something related to these rights, these kind of fundamental rights that doesn't matter where you're from. It's just you are a person and you have these rights. And I really like that perspective of not thinking about it based on just what country you're in or what county you're in. It's you're a person and inherently the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to you. And then I got the fellowship and I was like, okay, well, this is going to be in the States, so it's actually international. What is that space? It's really what I learned kind of that second year, which is it's civil rights, right? That's going to be the version I'm going to work on, right? But then I realized with the language stuff, well, really, it's a little bit international. I mean, these people are coming from all over. These rights are rights that people do have in certain other countries, right? And like I learned that in Europe, they had an understanding of there are other languages. So how can I kind of bring some of that to this work? How could I kind of make sure that what is acknowledged in other places is kind of part of what we start doing here? So, but that meant I had to know the American laws, right? And the federal laws and how do those apply to these clients I have? Because I could, but it's really hard in American law, domestic law, to bring in, there's a European Charter for Human Rights. And that's why you have to, but that doesn't apply to New York. That doesn't apply to the States. So, but what are the concepts, right? This kind of universal understanding that, like you were saying before, people have communication needs. People have certain basic rights. How do we make sure they have access to those? And so that's what I started to, from international human rights, transition to civil rights, but particularly kind of this language piece, which I thought was really a way for me to get to some of those topics that I had learned, from. But it's really from, if I had not studied abroad, I would never had that exposure point. If I had never done the clinic, I would not have that exposure point. I find that there's so many chances that can happen in your life, that one path or this or the other, and that kind of just worked out the right way. So it's kind of just lucky, honestly, to get that exposure at just the right points along the way.
Incredible story, and all starts is traveling.
Yeah, traveling. I mean, I know you love traveling, but for that trip, I don't really think it would have shaped those kinds of ideas. So, yeah.
And what is your current role with DOJ?
Oh yeah, current role. I mean, my current job this is a mouthful from my office, but DOJ has many offices. The U.S. Department of Justice has many offices. One of the offices I work in the Office of Justice Programs. That office generally gives out a lot of grants to state and local governments, agencies, and law enforcement. And so my office is the Office for Civil Rights in the Office of Justice Programs. And so I'm a deputy director there. And what we do is we enforce federal civil rights laws. So say you apply for grants and you get it from the Office of Justice Programs, one of the program offices, like the Bureau of Justice Assistance is a program office. If you get money from U.S. Department of Justice through that office, through that Bureau of Justice Assistance, because you receive those funds, which is called federal financial assistance, you have to comply with federal civil rights laws. So because you applied for and received that federal financial assistance, automatically one of the conditions is you will comply with a variety of federal civil rights laws. So my office enforces those federal civil rights laws that are applicable. So if you got a grant and say you're a law enforcement agency, automatically you have to comply with like Title VI, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and those. And if my office gets a complaint that someone was subject to national origin discrimination and you're an entity that receives federal funds, if we have jurisdiction, we can open an investigation. And we can determine whether you're being compliant with your obligation, which was you got the funding, and with that funding comes the obligation. Mm-hmm. And that comes with everything that's considered federal financial assistance comes with civil rights obligations. And there's many entities across the country, state, local government, nonprofits, all types of entities, if they get that, what is considered federal financial assistance, they have those obligations. And the public, if they feel like they've been subject to discrimination, can file a complaint. And we can get complaints every week from people all over the country saying, I think I was subject to discrimination by this entity. We check. I mean, the attorneys, in my office, we have an amazing team of attorneys that are very committed to civil rights enforcement. They check, they make sure that we gave funding, that we have jurisdiction, that it's an issue we can address. If it is, and we open an investigation, we try to resolve what the issue was. We try to identify what happened here. Is this a real problem? What do we need to do to address it? And we try to resolve it. That's primarily what our role is. And the luxury is, working at DOJ, is we have a lot of other partners. So my office is the Office of Justice Programs, Office for Civil Rights, but we also have the Civil Rights Division, which is another part of DOJ. So we work with them. We have our U.S. Attorney's offices, which are all over the country, and a lot of them have civil. So there's a lot of great partnerships that we have when we're doing civil rights enforcement. It's just not one office doing it all. There's a lot of great within DOJ relationships, because a lot of people don't know this, but one of the key priority areas for DOJ, like if you look on the mission statement now, is civil rights. It's like one of the top 3 things that's a priority for the current administration. And it usually is, at the top of the priorities overall for DOJ. DOJ does a lot of things, but civil rights enforcement is really one of the priority areas. And I'm lucky that I've been able to work 14 years now in doing civil rights work at DOJ.
Well, and thank you for doing that, because that really puts our country in such a different spot in the world as we are. And we will be talking about this later on today during our conversation. What really motivates you?
What motivates me?
Yes.
I think what really motivates me, particularly on the work side, is, it does take work, but you have an opportunity to make sure that the promise of equivalent access, the promise of a program, it's not really valuable to give out federal funds if a whole group of people is excluded from those funds. If victims of crime can't access the crime victim assistance program in a certain state because the materials aren't in a language that they can understand, that program is not doing what it's supposed to do because it's not including the whole community. Your point, the information's not there. They're totally eligible. They should be getting it. And what really drives me is, how can we help as many people as possible in those situations, right? Not because we're going to threaten enforcement, but how can we work with these entities to make them learn and understand there's a way that we can do this to make sure that everyone can participate, that everyone can get access to information. My drive for this really is, there are lots of people that don't know about their civil rights. And if they do come to us, I think we have it's such an important obligation to make sure that we're enforcing them. And there's lots of people that don't even know that they can file a complaint, and that doesn't cost any money, and it's very easy to do. But if they do, my focus every day is to help as many people as we possibly can. And we have so many committed staff and attorneys and amazing professional staff that work with me in that every day. And it's great to be part of a team that's so committed to kind of that goal and that mission. And it's really unique. I mean, that I got to do this, continuing for my work right out of law school, and keep doing that kind of work at DOJ. It was the best. I mean, nothing's better than finding the thing you like and then being able to do it at a nonprofit for 5 years and then do it for 14 years at a federal agency after that. I mean, I'm very lucky. Like, I always appreciate that every day I can do that. And how many people can we help? How can we inform people? How can we educate people about their rights? How can we educate these entities about what they need to do? Because it's not really valuable to say to someone, oh, you violated X. You have to do more than that. You have to explain to them, what is that? What should you be doing? How should you be able to do it? That's what really needs to be done. And I love the training aspect of it. I love the community engagement part when we get the chance to talk with these communities and see what are the needs, what needs to be addressed. It's really amazing to be able to do that as work, because it doesn't really feel like work when you can have those kinds of engagements with the public, with these stakeholders, get these kind of opportunities too. I'd like to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. Have you worked on, do you have a story when you worked on a program or initiative with the federal government or with your Office of Civil Rights, and then you saw results in real life, and then you come back and like, oh my God, we made it happen, and now I can see it community prospering. How did it feel to see that?
I mean, that feeling is always great when you can do that no matter what your work is. And I think, all of us should consider ourselves lucky when we can kind of see that. I mean, one of the things that I started on a long time ago, and a lot of people know that when you start on something, you're never really sure where it's going to end up, right? You don't know, like, this could be a failure, which is fine, and then you learn from it. But one of the things I started on very, very long ago, I feel so old now saying this, but I think it was like in 2007, there was a client that came in and they had real difficulty getting an interpreter in a court setting. And I was in New York at that time, and I just didn't fully understand the rules and what was going on. And I was like, it feels like they should get an interpreter. Like, why is this not? And I was really kind of annoying to the court administration then. I even saved the letter that I sent to them, like, why is this not happening? Like, why is this not? Can you explain to me why this person's not, and they sent me a letter back to like, this person should get it in all types of cases at no cost, civil or criminal cases. I was like, okay, that's good. That's good to know that. And when I started working, and I did a little bit of work with the courts, but when I started working at DOJ in the Civil Rights Division, they had just started a new project, and it was called the State Court Language Access Initiative. And I was like, wait, we're going to be able to do this like in different state courts around the country. And, we had this incredible team. It was a great project. And we started getting complaints in from people in different states saying, hey, I'm not getting an interpreter at no cost in all my civil and criminal cases in whatever state or this state. And so we started working with those state courts, not because we're threatening litigation or things like that. We would work with them and say, we're getting these complaints. Like, what is the policy now? What is the thing? I worked on that project the entire time I was at the Civil Rights Division for 13 years. And I will tell you, over the years, you saw that change happen. It's like, oh, this court, we have this agreement with this court, and they agreed all civil criminal cases at no cost to the person. This other court then did it. This other court, I think, saw what happened with these other two courts, and they proactively did it. Over time, we started seeing that not everyone and not everything's perfect, but we really started seeing the progression. In communities we not even had a complaint from, they were proactively saying, oh, this feels like where we need to be. What can we do? I was at a conference in this one state, and I was there to talk about language access generally, but the court system, like the Supreme Court, they said, while you're here, could you just stop by and just talk to us about like this language access court thing you guys are doing? I remember talking to them, and it's kind of scary because, you're an attorney, but it's like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and you're not going to say no, right? You're like, no, I'm not interested. So I went and we talked, and then I found out like time later, like they started doing a language access. They started implementing the policies. Like sometimes you don't know what the thing is that's going to get someone kind of moving. But I'll say by the time, the work is ongoing, and it's incredible work that the Civil Rights Division is doing for language access in state courts. But one of the things that we got to work on while we were there, and just as I started there, which was in 2010, was the American Bar Association said, hey, this language access court stuff's important to us. We're going to develop standards for courts for language access, a whole document that explains. So we got to work with all these interpreters and translators and court staff and other stakeholders, and we developed an ABA standard for language access in courts that encompassed a lot of the stuff that we were doing. Now, it's not a DOJ thing, and it's not required by federal law, but it was really this good collection of best practices, what courts should be doing. I say that because it shows that others were looking at this topic. A lot of this work cannot be done in silos, right? Like American Bar Association is doing this, state courts decide on their own, stakeholders in different communities might say, hey, that state has to do it, why doesn't ours? And so they start filing complaints. It all moves. That's all to say, there's been a lot of progress in that space. But that's just one space, right? That's just state courts. But it means that sometimes entire state court systems now have improved interpreter policies, particularly in ways that the community might not realize why, but that this is part of our work. It wasn't all of our work, but it was part of our work. It happened to be at the right time. We happened to be in the right place. We happened to push this the right way or that the right way. And overall, what happens? Improved access to the court system, right? Whether you're a criminal defendant or you're seeking a protection order in a civil case, there should not be the language barrier. And that makes you feel good because you realize like, okay, if I can make sure, doesn't mean you win the case, but it just means you get to say what you need to say. You get to participate in your language. And so that progress was really incredible to see. It took time. It was like 12 years, 13 years, but slowly it really did progress. And it really is, it's hard sometimes to look back from where you started because you realize, wow, it wasn't that good. And it's a lot better. You know, I don't think they were perfect, but I think it's also a good model for other work. I mean, not just say courts. What's the other circumstance? Is it this setting or that setting, right? But you can learn from those approaches and where they're successful. And I think the state court one for me is really one when I look back, like incredible attorneys you got to work with, you know, a lot of support from leadership throughout different administrations, even not just one administration, throughout different administrations. And we saw a lot of progress. And the goal was improving access to justice, improving access to interpreters. And that's what we were able to do. And it's really nice to look back now and say, wow, I can really see the progression from like this letter I sent to New York court, like I think it was 2007, to the head of the court interpreting services to, you know, where we are now, where it turns into this is what we should be doing. This is like common practice. Because you can get anywhere where people are like, oh, this is what we should be doing. That's important because the impact on the community is huge.
It's huge. Incredible.
You don't need to have credit. You don't need to take credit for that. What you need to realize is like, that's important. This is important for, like you were saying, like for equity, for inclusion. That's why this is important. It's not important just because, well, there's a federal statute and da-da-da-da. Okay, fine. But for that community, for what you can do for that community, that's really important to me too. And when you can see that happen and they proactively are doing it, that really shows a commitment to their community because we're in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. That's their community that comes in the door every day, that they see every day. And when they make that kind of commitment, that community sees that. And I think that's what's also really important about this kind of work too, is those are real people, real families with real needs. And understanding that and addressing that, whatever the reason you're doing it, is important, you know.
Indeed. I cannot even imagine how many changes, how many families' lives it changed. And talking about inclusion, what inclusion means to you?
I mean, for me, inclusion, it's always important to take stock of kind of who is our community, who's in our community, right? And especially like with this kind of work, it's what are the barriers? Because that's what's preventing someone from feeling included, right? Like there's barriers here, there's barriers there. Why is that there? You know, does that need to be there like that? Does this need to be this complicated of a process? Does this need to be like, I have to put in this request in this form? And, you know, sometimes what stops inclusion are antiquated systems that were designed at a time that wasn't the community, right? Mm-hmm. You know, there are certain policies that I would see in the courts work and even in my work now at OJP in Office for Civil Rights, where the policy is 40 years old. That community is a totally different composition than the community now. So it means keeping up with who's actually in your community, right? Like you can't rely on something that's so outdated that doesn't represent who's there, who lives there, their needs. The change in times of technology. I mean, you can't have antiquated systems. I mean, you can't have policies that are from antiquated systems that don't exist anymore, that are not the population you have there. So when I think of inclusion, I think, are you really taking an accurate stock of who's there? Mm-hmm. Are you figuring out what barriers they have today? Because sometimes it's systems with antiquated notions of how things work. Do you walk through the shoes of that person in their day? That's always an important thing I always tell people, especially with the language access work, is I understand you have a written language access plan in policies and procedures, but no one sees that. What they see is the front door when they walk through the door, the first person they interact with. If you want to know how to make it more inclusive, pretend walking through or actually walk through what they have to go through to get to. That's where you need to address it because the first person they see, security guard even, what the door says, what posters are up and what languages. Does the staff person at the desk know what to do if someone walked up and spoke Farsi? What would they do? That's how you address it. Not, well, we did a thing and we wrote it and we put it on a shelf. That's not going to help that person. So I think inclusion also means walking through that actual day. Mm-hmm. You know, in any area, especially on the civil rights side, right? Like I arrive at the building, I use a motorized wheelchair. There's no ramp, there's no access. I don't know, maybe that building has all the things I need, but no one's thought through what would my experience be to get into that building. It's no different for this area either. Like, I can't even read the sign that says, go down the hall here to get this form. You have to walk through that, I think, to understand the barriers. And then once you realize the barriers, address that. Don't guess. I think sometimes people guess. So like, oh, I know what it is. It's this, this, and that. You have to do the work of walking through. It's kind of like user tested. You have to actually walk through and simulate what they would need, what they're going to do, what interactions are they going to have. The one I always kind of ding people on, or I would make people think about is telephone menus. If I were to call after hours, would I be able to leave a voicemail, or would I know I'm leaving a voicemail if I can't understand a language? Like if I speak or communicate a language other than English, what phone prompts would I have? Maybe one for English and two for Spanish, but that's not the community that we have here. How can I leave like, think about the real interactions. I always say, think about those moments that person would need to interact with you. And if there's barriers there, how can you address those? That's an important part for me when I'm thinking about inclusion. Not just, there's a statute, there's this thing. One of the ways we can kind of think through the systems they have to go through.
That's precisely, I agree with you, because that's language really does elevate this human experience that we have. And that brings us to the conversation how US is really so unique. Because again, we are going back to the fact that we do not have a state language. We have more than 350 different languages that are currently being spoken in US. And it's so unique due to this immigration policies and our diversity. Because again, if you talk about the fact that language is not just a tool for communication, it's the way how we think. And can you imagine? So, of course you do, because that's what you do for a living. So many different people from so many different cultures come here, and that gives us this incredible innovation, entrepreneurial shape. And that's, I personally so much appreciate, because I wasn't able to do it in my country, but here I was able to start the business in Washington, D.C. I think it was not by surprise that I ended up here, and I am so grateful for that opportunity. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people like me, and because we have all this diversity of thinking, it doesn't allow this country to have this blind spots. We all contribute to this. What do you think about this? Do you think that language access in the US that we have, I'm pretty sure it's very unique, allows us to be who we are as a nation?
And I mean, to your point, how can I hear those ideas of that other person if I don't have a way to communicate with them, right? Like I might be missing something, a perspective that is so important to a project or to a company or to a product that I'm trying to make, because I can't communicate with that person. I talk about this sometimes in the context of when we're trying to get information. There's lots of places we try to get information. It could be a classroom.
Right.
It could be at the doctor's office. If you can't get that information, you can't do your job.
Right.
And so to your point about, well, if I know my community includes people from a lot of different language communities, how am I going to make sure I can communicate with them? Because I might be missing out on a good idea, a good project, something they can share with me that no one else can, to your point, because they bring such a unique perspective. And so it is very important in the language access area to understand the why is not just because it's a thing and we have to do it. The why is I'm missing out on all of this if I don't have a way to get this information. One of the things I've been looking at a lot recently is public participation in public settings. So like city council meetings and things like that. They have a proposal to build a new building here and like a new thing, but maybe I want to be one of the businesses in that new building. How do I participate? What do I need to do? What is this project? That's very important information. And to your point, that could be a great small business in that community. That could be a great project or nonprofit or whatever they want to start, but they don't know the meeting's happening or what they're talking about, or that there's this tax incentive or this rebate that they could apply for to start their business, because that information's not shared in the language they understand. They have all the drive. They have all the drive to do it, but they don't have the information they need.
And again, talking about that, this country is built on small businesses.
Very much so. Yeah.
Every 10th American is either deaf or hard of hearing. Every 6th American is limited English proficiency. So those communities can bring so much to the table.
Sure. And even from its founding, like if you look at something like a long, long time ago, there were language communities in the original colonies for sure, right? Like German speaking and, Dutch speaking, like there were these different communities. Even some of our founding documents, when they were published in German.
Right.
They were published in different languages. And it wasn't Spanish at that time. They were in different languages, and certain states even had their laws written in other languages, representing those communities. And so it's not some new thing. So that's why I bring that up. It's not some new thing. It's actually a thing we understood at the beginning. And maybe we just need to remember that this is part of our fabric, as far as it's here.
Yeah. How do you think our language access in US is different from other countries? We can talk about Australia. Australia doesn't have a state language either.
Yeah, Australia is a very interesting one. For us, generally the way it works in the US is, we have our federal laws that kind of cover everything. If it's, it's a federal statute or a federal regulation, but we also have a lot of state and local laws and local ordinances that dictate kind of different things. The challenge, I think, for me that I've seen is there's not a national process, though, for interpretation beyond kind of medical and court settings. That's a real challenge. So going to Australia, right? Like in Australia, my understanding is there was a concerted effort, both with the government and I think a government-created entity, to create a system of national certification for both interpretation and translation, not just in courts and medical, but for other types of specialty areas. And there was a real value and investment we should do a centralized thing for the benefit of the communities that we have, which are many different language communities in Australia, right? And they don't have an official federal and national language either, to my understanding. So how did they do that? They realized the investment of it would be so much better if we have a centralized way to train, certify. And the way it works, my understanding is it's a national database where you can look up by language and see, this interpreter with this specialty or this translator with this specialty. I can't imagine that wouldn't be a benefit here. I know sometimes the hardest thing for people to do is figure out, I know they need an interpreter. How do I find one? How do I get one for this specialty, right? So I think that is an interesting contrast. Like that would be an incredible resource to have. And there are national databases, I'm sure there's certain entities and organizations have national databases with certain languages, but not one that's kind of vetted testing, with certifications and things that you can kind of, it's a vetted test. It's just not this company has this list and this company has this list. I find that to be interesting, as far as talking specifically about Australia. They're kind of centralized, not just directory and database of interpreters and translators and other linguists, but the concerted effort to have a uniform kind of certification process and vetting and, verified testing. Mm-hmm. There's lots of testing that happen in the US, but sometimes it's just this private company has theirs, this other private company has theirs, and it's really hard to know, like, how does that compare? How does that? So going to Australia, I think that's the thing I think of, when I think of Australia is centralized. And then my understanding is that in Australia, it's not just for state and local governments to use, but if you're a private entity, like pick on attorneys like a private attorney, it's my understanding that you can actually use that list too. You pay whatever the rate is, but that's very helpful. It's not just for government. It's for anyone that needs access to a linguist. And I find that pretty interesting. I don't know of a system like that in Europe necessarily. I know they have a very strong commitment because of the European Union to have materials available, official materials available in the many languages that are spoken, but I don't know of a centralized kind of database like that on the European side. I don't know if you do, but I don't know.
No, I don't believe so. Anything in Canada that you would highlight?
Well, Canada has, I think one of the things, by design and just by structure, right, we have the automatic French, right? And so it's interesting to see by design, in Canada, decisions and government agency notices and websites that are always available in both languages. Right. Or by and large are available in both languages, especially at the kind of national level, not just in Montreal. Some people are like, that's just in Montreal. No, it's across the board. Like you can be in British Columbia and the materials are going to be available in French as well. And I think that's a really interesting commitment that you see. So you can do it. Right. This is also the thing, right? Some people are like, we can't do that. I'm like, there's other places that are already doing this. I know they're different. I know they're not the United States. But what pieces can you take from? What can you learn from? Maybe we can't do a national database with all the certification, but what can we learn from that? Could we do a version of that? You're like the Canadian thing. Yes, I know, like we don't have an official language and Spanish isn't an official language either, but it is the second most common almost everywhere in the US, right? So how do they do that? How do they structure that? And it's a smaller country, I get that, but what are the things we can learn about structuring and formalizing that commitment? Because I think that's what you were talking about before. You're showing your commitment.
Right.
It's not just acknowledging, oh, these different language communities are here. What's your commitment to address their needs? That's important too.
And then, of course, our setting is different. And we will be talking about this further, and we are going to be talking about Title VI, non-discrimination and origin, no matter language that we speak, right? So, but again, if we are going to, so now we are comparing to other countries, how US is unique. We do not have a language by constitution, but this innovation comes at a cost, right? This sense of freedom and entrepreneurship. So we are talking about how wonderful this life that we have here, but we also have challenges, right? So I was thinking about funding, one of those. What political resistance? Do you think about something else that you can talk about?
Resources always comes up. I mean, I worked on a lot of Title VI language access matters, and every single one of them, there's something about resources, there's something about cost, and there's a lot of ways to address that, right? A long time ago, I remember the Civil Rights Division put out a letter, and they said cost alone cannot be an excuse for compliance. You can't just say, oh, it costs something, therefore I don't have to comply with these civil rights obligations. That's not going to be a reason. Like, you need to explain why. And what that means is, well, you're saying cost, but how do you figure out the estimate? How do you calculate that? Well, it seems like, well, that's not really a number. Did you show me how you figured out that we're not, because no one's asking you to have all interpreters in any possible language available all day long, and all content in every single language. We're asking you to identify the key communities, how you're going to address them, and the key content, how you're going to translate them. What are those estimates like? Because that's the more realistic representation of the cost. Okay, you can't do them all at once. No one's asking you to do them all at once. Phase 1 could be this. Phase 2 could be this. Let's phase it in slowly. That's different than feeling the weight of all these things at once. Let's prioritize this, let's prioritize that. While we're doing that, okay, you send it out for translation. Does your translation agency use translation memory? Does it use tools so that you're not paying to retranslate all those words all over again? If you have a change in the form, you just change the date on the form and the new signature line. You don't pay to retranslate every word. So are you using the tools that cut down on the costs? Or, like I said, is it old policies that are, we send out for translation. It sends out by fax. Okay, well, let's make sure we have a digital version and that we get a translation memory. There's cost savings. The other thing I talk to people about is, especially state and local government, are you, each of the different counties or cities, you're doing your own language contract with the different companies each time. It's a lot of administrative work. Is there a centralized state contract that you can be part of? There's a lot of work. That's a lot of costs. You're going to have a different rate than the statewide contract for your one city or for your one town. So are you using existing contracts? Are you getting a higher rate because you have the option to use that, but you didn't know about it? So do you have those kinds of options? Those are the kinds of conversations I have when I talk about resource, because it's not that you get a pass and you have to comply with civil rights obligations. It's, okay, let's see what we're really talking about. Show me the actual estimate. Show me when you anticipated this many interpreter events and it would cost X amount. Okay, fine. What do you anticipate is that for in-person? Is that for video? Is that for telephonic? It's getting real. Well, let's really talk about it. What would it be? I understand you cannot have a Fulani interpreter there all day long, every day, for the one chance that one person's going to walk in. Fine. Maybe that's a telephonic encounter. How much would that actually cost? It wouldn't cost $250 for an in-person. It would cost maybe $1.50 a minute on a telephonic or a video. So let's really talk about what we're talking about here. Let's not make up a fabricated notion of 350 languages I need to have available at all times. So I like to talk practically about who's in your community, what are the encounters really going to be like, and what are real practical estimates that you have for this. And then no one's saying you have to wake up tomorrow and everything magically is just there and fixed. It takes time, but the answer can't be, we're not going to do anything because it's hard, or we're not going to do anything because it might take resources. That's not an answer. You can start on something and slowly build up. But the answer can't be, anticipating it'll cost anything, I will do nothing. That's not an option. That's not an option. If you're required to, because you're an entity that receives federal financial assistance, that can't really be an option. Like, I prefer not to because I can anticipate this will take resources. That's not really going to work in a lot of instances. That's not going to be a very good answer. But there's plenty of people in a lot of excellent civil rights offices and different federal agencies that do this work. We have the conversation. We talk with them about, okay, well, let's identify the priority things. Let's identify the priority languages. Let's start with that. Let's identify the key areas. No one's asking you to translate all 300 pages of your website in 350 languages. Yeah. No one's ever asking that. Let's talk about the real things, the real practical things, the steps you're going to take, how we can move towards that, because the community will see that right away. Oh, all of a sudden there is a version of my language. Oh, it says that I can come in and get an interpreter. I never knew that before. That's important. That's not just important because complying with civil rights law. That's important because you're a public service, and that's something that is a connection you can make that you couldn't make before. And that has value too. It's not just about the dollars and cents. That has real value too. Like, you're there to help that community. They're part of that community. Let's make that connection. Let's make sure you can engage with them.
So do you see any other challenges apart from funding?
Resources are always brought up. I can't think of a matter where it was a language access matter. Like, never mind, we have this. This is not an issue. Sometimes people feel restricted because of there's sometimes where certain states have certain constitutional things that say, like, English is the official language in this state and da-da-da-da. But then you have to just politely remind them that the federal statute is the one that has priority here. So you can't say if you get federal funds and you have to comply with Title VI, but I don't, because there's this state that's not a thing. That's not a defense. You have to comply with the mandate that comes with the funding, independent of what your state law says. So even if you have a state or local law that says English is the official law here, because the reason why you have to comply with Title VI is not because you're in that state, it's because you receive federal funding. That's the reason for the obligation. And so you have to comply with Title VI and related obligations. It's not, you can't just say, oh, I happen to be in a state where it means I don't have to. No, that's not how it works. And then we're pretty honest with people. That is part of getting these funds. So when people apply, they're given notice that if you apply for these funds, these are the civil rights laws that you have to comply with. Mm-hmm. And we tell them when they get the award too, these are the civil rights laws. So it's nothing's hidden. You know that from the outset, when you get the funds, and that's fine. But if you don't have to apply.
And what agencies within different states right now, in general, apply for federal funds?
Oh my gosh, there's about, in our federal, it's hard to talk across the entire federal government, but in our federal government, there's about 30 or so federal agencies that give out grants. There's probably more than that, but the ones I'm thinking of that have civil rights offices that give out federal grants of any kind, right? Like the U.S. Department of Commerce gives out grants. The U.S. Department of Agriculture gives out grants. And who can apply for those? It depends on the program. A lot of times we're talking about state or local government entities or parts of those governments. So it might be in the state version of the Environmental Protection Agency, not the federal one, but the state one. They apply for a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but they also apply for EPA for a grant. Mm-hmm. So there's some entities that grants from multiple agencies. But the civil rights obligations, a lot of them are across the board. Okay. It counts as federal financial assistance. You have to comply with Title VI. I know you're getting it from 4 different federal agencies. You still have to comply with Title VI in your programs. But there's a lot of variety. For DOJ, I can tell you that the easy way to say it is courts, cops, and corrections. Okay. So largely state and local courts. Same thing with law enforcement agencies. State correctional institutions, like an entire state correction system, or like a local jail or a sheriff that has a jail, or a county jail. And they receive all different types of funding. Sometimes it's for hiring staff. Sometimes it's for new equipment. Sometimes it's to develop programs that are really helpful for communities, like a drug court program. Right? So to help people who have experienced substance abuse. And so a different kind of approach for those types of criminal cases. It's drug court or a veterans court. That's another one, right? So there's sometimes very specific to programs, but that helps that community. That's the goal. We want to make sure we're helping these communities, to be partners in these communities, to encourage new ideas and new approaches in these different types of settings. For DOJ, it's usually courts, cops, and corrections. That's who we largely give funding to. But so many federal agencies, so many different opportunities. And, during COVID, right? Recovery Act funds. individuals even could get that type of funding, that kind of assistance. Not all that was considered federal financial assistance, but generally there are many opportunities for grants. Some people feel like, oh, it's just for states, nonprofits, governments, non-governmental organizations. They're doing a lot of great creative stuff with different federal grants. And it's what keeps some of these programs open. I mean, subsidies for childcare programs, that's a nonprofit, or, certain community organizations. I mean, without those federal funds, they couldn't do the great work they do in their communities. And so there's a lot of variety, but we do want to make sure that, they understand what their obligations are, if they're applicable, but to help them, help them understand, help them meet their obligations. And there's a lot of opportunities. A lot of federal agencies do a lot of great outreach, talking about the program, how to apply, how to use our systems. We offer trainings. We try to do as much as we can to work with those different groups because they're helping everyone. Right? They're not saying, they're helping everyone in their community, and we want to encourage that.
And I want to emphasize healthcare, of course, because any healthcare organization that takes Medicare, Medicaid, or any of the insurance related to Affordable Care Act, any of the market plans, they all have to be in compliance with
a lot.
1557.
Yeah, the 15.
Right?
Yeah. So, and that's a federal statute, right? Like Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act is a federal statute. That's a specific part of a federal statute. And that is the non-discrimination part. There's many parts of the Affordable Care, but that's the non-discrimination part. That's the part that says, if you're covered, you have to make sure you don't discriminate on all these bases, and it lists them out. That's the reason why people have to comply, because you're given notice. Are you covered in the Affordable Care Act? Well, that means you have to comply with this non-discrimination provision.
Can I ask you about telehealth? Because I believe that telehealth now falls under 1557.
I don't work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but yeah, it's my understanding that, that is being addressed. And in that setting, there's a lot of work that's being done in the HHS in different offices. HHS has many different offices as well, like DOJ, that are addressing telehealth because that is a reality, right? Not just because of COVID, but because of a means of communication. I mean, we have the same thing in state courts. Before COVID, there was some remote interpreting, but certainly there's very few courts now that have not done that. Right. So telehealth is kind of like a version of that, from my world. But yeah, telehealth is really important. But again, we don't give up the obligations, right? It still has to be meaningful. Yeah. It still has to be in a way that allows someone to access the service or the provider, right? Because you can't say, oh, well, I picked this platform. I know no one can access it, and I don't have any language services available. That's not going to be very compliant, right? Like, that's not equivalent to the doctor's office or the medical professional's office, because you can get an interpreter there. And if I can't even get on the platform in the first place, the thing I'm trying to do is get medical access, and the platform you chose and language services you don't provide, I can't do that. That's where the problem is. It's about this access thing we were talking about before. It's, right. I want to get access to a medical provider, and you need to talk to me to understand what I need, but the platform you chose is blocking that. That's the barrier. And it wouldn't be there if I was in person, but you're using telehealth, so you need to make sure it's accessible in some way to me. And how do we do that? I mean, it's been somewhat addressed, right? Like, we need to follow the same obligations we do in an in-person setting. Is it a competent interpreter if it's an oral communication, right, with someone who's LEP? Things like, is the connection the right way? Is it a platform that's usable? Like, are the instructions available in other languages? These are all things that prevent someone from having that interaction. You just can't say telehealth and be like, again, walk me through the steps a person would have to walk through. Could they actually use this? You can say that, but show me that it would work for someone who's LEP. Because the website is not available in another language, the instructions aren't, it doesn't work on their phone. Like, I don't get there. I don't get that access if those things are in the way. It's barriers.
So let's summarize. What legal frames right now we have in place in the United States right now? We have Title 6, ADA, 1557, right?
There's a lot. Right now, as far as like federal civil rights, a lot of people, when they think of language access, they think of Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is very important. It covers a lot of different areas. It covers housing and employment, but Title 6 is just one of the titles. And Title 6 is the one that says, and this is the important two words, which I always emphasize, no person in the U.S. shall be subject to discrimination based on race, color, or national origin by a program or activity receiving federal funds. No person. Well, what if they're not a citizen? They're a person, right? That's there. They're a person in the U.S. They could be visiting from Uzbekistan for their family for just the summer. That's a person that's protected. If they were subject to discrimination based on race, color, national origin by a program that receives federal funds. Well, what is that? One of those programs I said before that applied for a grant and received a federal grant. That would be federal funds. If they believe they're subject to discrimination, they could file a complaint or take other action to address that discrimination. That's a really important statute. And the other reason why it's really important is it includes national origin discrimination, which is really, when we look at like Supreme Court cases and private lawsuits and other kind of cases, the connection between national origin and language, right? That's really how you're protected under Title VI. You're from a particular country of origin, a particular language, and so Title VI prohibits national origin discrimination. And in national origin discrimination can include discriminating against persons who are LGBT. And that's the road. So that's kind of the ground, right? Like you receive federal funds, by and large, almost every program I think of, you have to apply that. So that's the start point. Now, there are other laws, right? There's regulations. But as far as laws, there are other specific statutes, like 1557 is a very specific part of a very specific statute. If you're not in the healthcare field or the healthcare readout, 1557 doesn't, you don't have to do anything, right? It doesn't mean anything for a private school somewhere, right? It's not meant to cover that. But that statute covers a specific category of institutions, medical providers. And so in addition to Title VI, there are specific rules for that. So this is always the floor. You all have to file Title VI. There are specific obligations. Both the statute, which is the language that Congress, when it became a law that Congress approved and the president signed, but then in the regulations, which is the newest thing, right? You have a statute, but that Congress says in a lot of statutes, you get these regulations that explain what this really means. And that's where the regulations go in. So you always have to apply Title VI, apply the statute, and then the related regulations. So if you're covered in 1557, include regulations addressing things like telehealth, use of children, right, in medical settings. Now, the statute doesn't have that in the language because you can't fit everything in the law, right? So the agencies write the regs that explain, what does this mean in this setting? Well, it means this. It means doing it like this. This is what we mean when we say a competent or qualified interpreter. This is what we mean when we say an emergent circumstance or an emergency or exigent circumstance or break. This is what we mean. This is where it would be permitted to use or not use. Those are the details that you need to know as a covered entity under that program. And if you have questions, and this is what we always tell people, the regs sometimes can't cover everything either. So sometimes agencies have to issue kind of informational material so that you training to further explain. Now, a lot of agencies that have civil rights offices, you could reach out to them and say, hey, I don't have a complaint or anything. I just want to understand, I was thinking of doing this. Would this be a good way? Or have you seen other programs like this? You can do that. You can have them and you can ask them for a presentation on this, an explanation of this. That's fine. They want you to do the right thing. There's nothing wrong with being proactive. It's better to be proactive than the agency gets a complaint in. I mean, you'll still talk to them, but it's under different circumstances. I always encourage people that, it says what it says in the statute. It says what it says in the regulations. Sometimes there's still questions. It's fine to ask those questions. Maybe there's an informational resource that they already developed. You just didn't know about it. You just looked. There's lots of great material that agencies create, especially on language access, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, so many new resources that explain what do I need to do? What do I need to think about? We just need the prompt to have a good approach. I know it's not intuitive. I'm not saying the native stuff is intuitive, but there are great resources, especially on this topic. Especially in the last, the last 10, 12, 13, the time that I worked on it, it's improved so much. The materials that are available for entities that are covered that explain what should I be thinking? What about this? What about this? But the hard part is keeping up, correct? There's always these new things. Telehealth was a thing before COVID, but it's used even more. AI has always been a part of translation, but it's the new version of the new approaches. So it's hard to keep up on everything and have resources available. So maybe it's not there yet. Maybe your question might be why the agency creates the resource. That's what I tell people too. Maybe if they get enough questions about a certain thing, like, we should just put out the thing once that explains it.
Talking about AI, where does DOJ stay and where the regulations are coming to what's AI?
So there's a lot of work being done on AI right now. I know our colleagues in the Civil Rights Commission have working groups, and actually they've had meetings. These are public. They've had meetings with other federal agencies to think about what does this mean for us, not only as federal agencies and what we do, because we do a lot of interactions. We have a lot of information we gather it. Can we use AI to help out? But also in our enforcement, like, there have been cases, going to the Civil Rights Commission specifically, where they said AI was used in this process that resulted in discrimination against a whole community, and that violates whatever civil rights law that was. That's actually been done already. I know that people want more of that, what's the concrete thing and what can and cannot do. And I think people are trying to figure out what that is, the guidelines. I know that across the federal government, there's an AI initiative across federal agencies where agencies are developing policies, developing approaches, because we have to think about it for how we're going to use it inside our federal agencies. But then, which I think your question is, what do you tell the public? What do you tell the entities that are covered how to use it? What's a good way? Or what are the things I should think about as far as privacy, security, effectiveness, and how do I know that product A is what I should use and product B has flaws? Like, again, it's not intuitive. Like, not many of us have had in-depth training on the development of AI, materials or components or processes. So it's ongoing work, and it's constantly changing. I mean, we have an executive order on AI, we have an AI working group at the federal level, a lot of federal agencies have it. Those kinds of questions can be asked too. People can ask those questions and say, look, I understand you have all these regulations and all this stuff, but we're thinking of doing this AI thing. What would that mean? Like, what should we be thinking about? What kind of resources do you have? Because I certainly don't want someone to implement an AI resource or a tool that results in discrimination against the community that's protected. That's not it.
But do you believe, okay, that's my personal belief, that at the moment do not have any AI solution that is going to provide language access on the same level as the equivalent of the law, because that will discriminate against certain languages. We do have certain tools that are developed maybe for Spanish, maybe for even Russian, and if you take Urdu, Farsi, and others, Tagalog, Tamil, those languages are not going to have exactly the same access to information.
Yeah, and it's because, and this is one of the things that's like brought up with AI, right? It's that the systems they're built on are inherently biased, and so that bias comes through.
Right.
But here, I think you're also talking about the lack of the informational source that's used to create the AI is also biased because it's based on the information that's available. And like, you're talking these different languages, right? But like half the content of the internet's only available in English. Well, if you're that means you don't have very much to work with in the first place. And for some of these languages, it's probably smaller. So I don't know how you can develop a tool that can address all the language needs, both, interpretation and translation. If you start with a very, very small content that doesn't have all the words, phrases, and terminology you're going to need to interact with the person, either orally or in a written form, your starting point is already so small that it could possibly cover the interactions. I think that's a really big goal, right? And so how can you call it a complete product if you know inherently it doesn't have enough information to address a healthcare setting, a school setting, and a legal setting in that language, in an automated way? And then I always ask people, I said, what does your field testing look like? Like, have you brought it to a group of Tamil speakers, use your example, and what was that interaction like? What did people say about the quality? Did they feel that it was equivalent to your question of a competent interpreter interaction? If the answer is no to all those, I don't think we have the product there, right? Like, it's just, you have to demonstrate that, which is the question. You can't just say, I think it is. Well, did you do the testing? Can you show that we did field testing in that language with the automated, whatever, oral communication or written communication. And then we compare those results to what happened when we gave them a trained linguist or a competent interpreter translator. And the satisfaction was the same. To your point, I haven't seen that.
Neither did I. And so at the moment, the federal government regulations for translation, at least in healthcare, if organizations use AI or machine translation, human linguist, I should say, has to review the document.
Yeah, I'll say that you're referring to the specific HHS regulation. That is my understanding of that regulation, that if you're going to rely, it says something like, I don't know the exact thing. It says something like, if you use an automated or machine translation to provide graded content, you can do that if after you have the output, you have that verified that communicates the message from the original source. That's a very, I've had matters that I had a chance to work with. So Rhett's vision where we had to address that topic because it comes out through investigation. And we had a very similar approach. What we said was you cannot rely solely on machine or automatic translation. Similar to what the regular, which is you can't just say, oh, we put it through this thing in. Okay, and then you checked it. You can't rely solely on it. You could do that, but then you have to check and make sure the quality is there. Because if the quality's not there, the person's not going to be able to understand. So it's fine, but it's okay, you can use it, but show me that it meets the quality standards. It's just like I was saying before, show me it meets the quality standards. And if you can, then that's fine, but you can't use it off the shelf without first demonstrating that. One, it's a product that can deliver that quality, or two, that someone's verified it.
Yeah, I'm going to be very curious to see where they're going to go with the regulations, AI, particularly in healthcare. It is
the topic that is kind of all of the topics, every single conversation, every single kind of event. It's the thing people are talking about. But I really like to, when I talk about, I really like to talk about how was the product created, what was the source content, how did you check to make sure that it's at the level. If I know that, that'll give me more comfort with it when it's out there. But I don't like knowing that a product might be out there without that verification. Because we have to look shiny, and I'm just going to buy it. Like, there should be something behind that all at once.
To me, it's further discrimination because that's 350 even more with certain dialects in U.S. Small languages, then we also have liability because right now with the human interpreters and LSPs like ours, we have professional liability. God forbid something happens, the liability is shared between us and medical provider when it comes to the tech company who is going to be sharing that liability.
And it's a good question because I don't know that anyone has an answer to that right or and when the moment comes up where we do have a situation where something terrible happens, which we don't want to happen at all, that's going to be a tough question.
Right.
Who share responsibility? Is it the person that bought the product? Is it the person that created the product? Is it some combination of that? Is it the provider that used it in the wrong way? Maybe. There's a lot of different conversations. And it's not clear today. That's right. It's not clear today.
We'll feel able with that. So now that we are concluding the conversation, thank you so much for your time. That was very interesting. For the organizations that are setting up their sort of operations to go, what recommendations would you give in terms of compliance? And do you believe that outside of compliance, there are other reasons to work on leverage access?
I think there's a lot of initial steps. Like say you're not up top for whatever reason, right? You just didn't realize you were covered, or this is just a new thing to you for whatever reason, right? And I know that's surprising, especially to linguists, people like that. It's been around for a long time, but say it's new to you. Say the topic's new to you. I was think a good starting point is find someone else who's already done it. So like if you're a nonprofit, find that other nonprofit that's kind of like yours that, I heard they have a program, or I heard they have a policy, or I heard you just have that starting conversation that might make you feel more comfortable. If you really don't have anyone to reach out to, I have to plug the DOJ website that talks about this. So, on LAP.gov, there's a lot of www.lap.gov. There's a lot of resources for that. How do I even start thinking about this, right? Like, there's like the assessment tool that's not a requirement to do it, but the kinds of questions you need to ask of what should we be looking at? What should we be thinking about? Who's our community? How should we address it? What is it we need to do? That's important. It's not just about legal requirement, right? That's important, and you receive federal funds. But it's also, who am I missing in my community? Like, if I'm a provider of a certain service, say I'm a nonprofit or a student, am I really missing 13% or 14% of my community? Am I doing a good job if I'm missing 1 out of every 7 people in my service area or my community? So there's that too. It's not the legal piece. It's that, why are we missing 15% of, maybe 14, 15% of who's in our community? They're eligible for our programs. We don't even know. Maybe they don't need their program services, but they don't even know they exist. So how can we say we're doing a good job if we're missing huge parts, of our community? Whether you're a government entity or a nonprofit or even some private entities that receive federal funds, it's really hard to say you're meeting your mission if you're omitting parts of the community. And it's not that every single community, every single language group is going to be like flooding your doors. It's just that, do they even know? Like, maybe they don't need your service, but at least you have a brochure that explains, or a website that explains this is what we do. If you have this thing, you can come here. Like, now I know. That's a great resource. I'll tell my friends in the community. That's a good thing. That's what you're there to do. You're there to help other people. A lot of this work is just simple human thing of, you're there to help other people. You're just letting them know that you're there and what you do. You might need you, they might not, but at least they know, they have the information to know this is where. And that's more important. The legal obligation is important, but for the program, that might be even more important. They know who we are, they know what we do, and they know that if they came in, we can help them. That's really good.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for your conversation today. Thank you for all the valuable information.
Sure, this happened.
Thanks.